The morning sun was still low over the Virginia countryside, casting long, cool shadows across the sprawling military base. The air smelled of cut grass and jet fuel, a familiar scent for the thousands of service members who called this place home. Among them walked a man named David, a career counselor with a solid reputation. He was not a young man anymore, but he was fit, sharp, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen enough of the world to not be easily impressed. His job was simple: help enlisted soldiers navigate their career paths, reenlistments, and transitions. It was a desk job for the most part, but David had earned his place through years of honest, if unspectacular, service. Standing next to him was a different breed of soldier entirely. His name was Mark, and he was a Navy SEAL. Mark was the kind of man who seemed to take up more space than his body actually occupied. He was broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a jaw set in a permanent expression of mild annoyance. He wore his trident pin as if it were a third eye, radiating an aura of intense, coiled energy. Mark had been invited to the base as a guest speaker for a massive morale event. Over 1,000 troop soldiers, airmen, and Marines had gathered in the massive indoor drill hall. The number was exactly 1,040, a fact that would later become seared into the memory of everyone present. The event was meant to be a showcase of elite military prowess. The base commander wanted to motivate the younger troops to show them what was possible with enough grit and dedication. Mark was the star of the show. He spent the morning walking through the rows of seated soldiers, shaking hands, signing autographs, and telling war stories that made the young privates' eyes go wide. He was charming in a blunt, aggressive way. He would slap a soldier on the back and say, "You think basic training was hard? Try Hell Week, kid." People laughed nervously. They were in awe. David watched from the sidelines. He did not like Mark. There was something about the SEAL's demeanor that felt less like confidence and more like a performance. David had known a few quiet professionals in his time, men who were lethal, but humble. Mark was not one of those. Mark needed everyone to know he was the toughest person in any room. As the morning wore on, Mark began drinking. It started with a coffee that smelled faintly of whiskey. Then, during a break, he was seen taking long pulls from a metal flask. His words began to slur slightly, but his ego only grew larger. By the early afternoon, the main event was scheduled. The 1,040 troops were seated in neat, noisy rows. The drill hall had a high ceiling and metal rafters, and the sound of 1,000 conversations echoed like a chaotic symphony. Mark was given a microphone. He stood on a small, temporary stage at the front. For the first few minutes, he was electric. He talked about surviving hypothermia in the Pacific Ocean. He talked about crawling through mud while live rounds cracked overhead. The crowd was riveted. They cheered. They clapped. They hung on his every word. But then, something shifted. Mark stopped talking about training and started talking about respect. Specifically, he started demanding it. "You see this pin?" he shouted, pointing to his chest. "This means I am better than every single person in this room. If you have not been through what I have been through, you are not my equal. You are not even close." A nervous ripple went through the audience. This was not motivation anymore. This was bullying. The base commander, sitting in the front row, shifted uncomfortably. He tried to catch Mark's eye, to give him the signal to wrap it up, but Mark was lost in his own performance. He began pacing the stage like a caged animal, pointing at random soldiers. "You," he snarled at a young female mechanic. "Could you last one day in my world? One day? No, you'd quit in an hour." The young woman's face turned red. Some of the soldiers around her put their hands on her shoulders to calm her down. David had heard enough. He was standing near the side of the stage, close enough to see the veins bulging in Mark's neck. David did not have a combat badge. He was not a SEAL. He was a career counselor. But he had a wife and 2 kids at home, and he had spent 20 years in the service learning one simple truth: respect is earned, not demanded. He stepped forward, not to cause a scene, but to quietly suggest that Mark take a break. He walked up the 3 small steps to the stage and approached Mark from the side. "Hey," David said in a low voice, not using the microphone. "That's enough. You're losing them. Let's get some water." Mark spun around. His eyes were bloodshot, and his lip curled in disgust. He looked at David, this average-sized, average-looking career counselor, and saw nothing but an obstacle. He gripped the microphone tighter and pointed it at David. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice booming through the speakers. David did not flinch. "I'm a career counselor, and I'm telling you, you're out of line. These are your brothers and sisters in arms. Apologize, and we can all move on." The 1,040 troops went completely silent. You could have heard a button hit the floor. They were watching two men face off on a small stage. One was a decorated Navy SEAL, a man trained to kill with his bare hands. The other was a pencil-pushing counselor. By every logical measure, this was not a contest. Mark seemed to realize this too. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He saw an opportunity to embarrass David in front of everyone. He wanted to make an example out of him. He took a step closer, invading David's personal space. He was taller by 2 inches and heavier by at least 40 pounds. He leaned down so his nose was almost touching David's forehead. He spoke into the microphone, but his voice was low and dangerous. "Don't forget I'm a Navy SEAL," he warned. The words echoed off the metal rafters. "I have killed people with my thumbs. I have drowned men in 3 inches of water. And you, a paper pusher, are going to tell me what to do." David did not move. He did not blink. He just stared straight ahead at Mark's chest, at the trident pin that had come to represent so much arrogance. Mark's face twisted with rage. He could not stand being defied, especially not in front of an audience. He made a decision in a fraction of a second. He pulled back his right hand, formed it into a fist, and swung it in a short, sharp arc. The punch connected with the side of David's face, just below the cheekbone. The crack of knuckle on bone was sickeningly loud, amplified by the microphone. A collective gasp rose from the 1,040 troops. Several people screamed. Women covered their mouths. Men stood up from their seats. On the stage, David's head snapped to the side. He staggered back 1 step, then 2. Blood immediately began to trickle from a small cut near his eye, but he did not fall. He did not raise his hands. He did not run. He simply straightened his posture, wiped the blood away with the back of his hand, and looked back at Mark. There was no fear in his eyes. There was only a calm, cold disappointment. He spoke again, his voice steady despite the ringing in his ears. "Was that supposed to hurt?" he asked quietly. Mark blinked. He had expected tears. He had expected David to crumble, to beg for mercy. He had not expected this. For the first time all day, the SEAL looked uncertain. The crowd felt it too. The silence was no longer nervous. It was angry. A low murmur began to build, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. The troops were no longer on Mark's side. They were watching a bully punch a decent man in the face for no reason other than bruised ego. Mark did not know what to do next. He was used to people being afraid of him. He was not used to people standing their ground. He tried to puff himself up again, to reclaim the moment. "I'm just getting started," he growled. But his voice wavered. His confidence was gone. And that was when David made his move. Not with a punch. Not with a kick. He simply turned his back on Mark and walked toward the edge of the stage. He picked up the microphone stand and placed it aside. He looked out at the 1,040 soldiers, airmen, and Marines. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said. His voice was calm, almost fatherly. "This man is not what a warrior looks like. A warrior protects. A warrior serves. A warrior does not strike someone who is not a threat." The troops began to clap. Not for Mark, for David. The clapping grew louder and louder, until it was a thunderous ovation. Mark stood frozen in the middle of the stage, a man utterly alone despite being surrounded by over 1,000 people. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. He had punched a man in the face, and instead of winning, he had lost everything. He opened his mouth to speak, to try to salvage the situation, but no words came out. He looked left and right, searching for an ally, for someone to back him up. But the base commander was on his feet, his face red with fury, pointing toward the exit. Military police were already moving through the crowd. Mark's moment of triumph had become his moment of utter, humiliating defeat. He took one last look at David, who was now being helped by a medic who had rushed to the stage. David's eye was swelling shut, but he was smiling, not a smug smile, but a kind one. He was already forgiving Mark in his heart. That, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The military police reached the stage. They did not touch Mark at first. They simply stood around him, a ring of authority. Mark looked at them, then at the crowd, then at David, his shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him like air from a popped balloon. He dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a loud, echoing thud that was picked up by every speaker in the hall. Then he walked, head down, toward the exit. The troops did not cheer. They did not boo. They simply watched in stunned silence as the mighty Navy SEAL was led away. David sat down on the edge of the stage, holding a cold compress to his eye. A young private came up to him, tears in her eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you hit him back?" David looked at her with his one good eye. "Because," he said softly, "hitting back would have made me just like him. And I'm not a SEAL. I'm just a man who knows right from wrong." The young private smiled and saluted him. David returned the salute with his free hand. And somewhere in the back of the drill hall, the door slammed shut behind Mark. The story was over, but the lesson was just beginning. The fallout from that single punch was immediate and dramatic. Within an hour, the entire base was buzzing. Phones buzzed with texts and photos. Videos of the incident, shot from a dozen different angles by soldiers in the crowd, began appearing on social media. The title of the video was almost always the same: SEAL hits career counselor, gets shut down in front of 1,040 troops. The comments exploded. Some people defended Mark, saying that David had provoked him by challenging his authority. But the vast majority of people, civilians and service members alike, were horrified. How could a Navy SEAL, a member of the most elite fighting force on Earth, punch a non-combatant in the face during a morale event? The base commander acted without hesitation. He ordered Mark confined to a guest quarters building on the base, under guard. He was not allowed to leave. He was not allowed to make phone calls. He was essentially under house arrest while the investigation began. The commander then called David into his office. David's eye was now a deep purple, swollen almost completely shut. He had refused to go to the hospital, insisting he was fine. The commander shook his head in disbelief. "David," the commander said, leaning back in his chair, "you could have been killed. That man is trained to kill. Why didn't you just walk away when he warned you?" David sat up straight, despite the pain. "Sir, with respect, if I had walked away, what would those 1,040 troops have learned? They would have learned that might makes right. That you can bully people as long as you're tough enough. I couldn't let that be the lesson of the day." The commander was quiet for a long moment. He had been in the military for 30 years. He had seen bar fights, training accidents, and acts of heroism. But he had never seen anything quite like this: a career counselor with no combat training, standing up to a SEAL and winning without throwing a single punch. "You're a brave man, David," the commander said finally. "Braver than you know. Go home, rest, we'll handle the rest." David went home to a small house off base, where his wife, Sarah, was waiting. She had seen the video. Her hands were shaking as she opened the door. She didn't say anything at first. She just threw her arms around him and held him tight. "You idiot," she whispered into his chest, laughing and crying at the same time. "You absolute idiot. You could have died, but I didn't," David said, wincing as she accidentally touched his swollen eye. "I'm tougher than I look." She pulled back and looked at him. She had known him for 22 years. She had seen him change diapers, fix the leaky sink, and fall asleep on the couch during football games. She had never seen him as the hero of a viral video. "What happens now?" she asked. David shrugged. "Now, we wait." While David rested at home, the military legal system went to work. Mark's career as a Navy SEAL was effectively over the moment his fist connected with David's face. The Navy takes assault charges incredibly seriously, especially when they involve an officer striking an enlisted soldier. And the fact that it happened in front of 1,040 witnesses meant there was no room for she said. The evidence was overwhelming. The investigation took 2 weeks. During that time, Mark was moved from the base to a military detention facility. He was stripped of his weapons, his security clearance, and his prestige. He was allowed one phone call, which he used to call his father. His father, a retired Marine, listened in silence as Mark explained what had happened. When Mark finished, there was a long pause. Then his father spoke. "You disgraced yourself, son. You disgraced your team. And you disgraced that trident on your chest. I didn't raise you to punch a man who can't punch back." Mark had no response. His father hung up. Meanwhile, David became an unexpected celebrity. Not the kind of celebrity he wanted. but the kind the world thrust upon him. News outlets picked up the story. A career counselor standing up to a bully. It was a story that resonated far beyond the military. David was invited to speak on morning talk shows. He declined every invitation. A publisher asked if he wanted to write a book. He said no. A movie producer called, offering to buy the rights to his story for a six-figure sum. David laughed and said, "It's not a movie. It's just a Tuesday." But the attention did have one positive effect. Letters and emails began pouring in from all over the world. Most of them were from ordinary people, teachers, nurses, retail workers who had faced bullies in their own lives and had been too afraid to stand up. They thanked David for showing them that courage is not about being the strongest person in the room. It is about being the most grounded. One letter, from a high school student in Ohio, touched David more than any other. The boy wrote, "There's a kid at my school who punches me every day. I never told anyone because I was scared. After I saw your video, I went to the principal. They are helping me now. Thank you for being brave, so I could be brave too." David kept that letter in his wallet. He still carries it to this day. The day of the court-martial arrived. It was held in a large, wood-paneled courtroom on the base. The room was packed. David sat on one side, dressed in his crisp dress uniform. His eye had healed, though a faint scar remained below his cheekbone. Mark sat on the other side, dressed in a plain uniform with no insignia. His head was bowed. He looked smaller than he had on that stage. He looked like a man who had lost everything. The charges were read aloud: assault on a fellow service member, conduct unbecoming of an officer, and disorderly conduct. Mark's lawyer argued that Mark had been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder from multiple combat deployments. He argued that the alcohol had lowered his inhibitions and that he had not intended to hurt David. The lawyer asked for leniency. He asked for treatment instead of punishment. Then it was David's turn to speak. He walked to the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked him a simple question: "What do you think should happen to the accused?" David looked at Mark. Mark would not meet his eyes. David took a deep breath. The courtroom was silent. Everyone expected him to ask for the maximum penalty. They expected anger. They expected vengeance. Instead, David spoke softly. "I don't want him to go to prison," he said. "I don't want him to lose his pension. I don't want any of that. What I want is for him to get help. I have seen the same look in his eyes that I see in my own reflection after a bad day. He is not a bad man. He is a hurt man. And hurt people hurt people. So I asked the court to send him to a treatment facility. Not as a punishment, but as a rescue mission." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes. For the first time, he lifted his head and looked at David. His lips trembled. He mouthed two words: "I'm sorry." The judge, a stern woman with gray hair and steel-rimmed glasses, sat in silence for a long time. She looked at David, then at Mark, then at the packed courtroom. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. David," she said, "I have presided over hundreds of courts-martial. I have seen victims demand blood. I have seen families torn apart by bitterness. I have never, in all my years, seen a victim show this much grace. Your request is granted." She sentenced Mark to 6 months in a military treatment facility for PTSD and alcohol abuse. She also ordered him to write a formal letter of apology to every soldier who had witnessed the incident. And she ordered him to surrender his trident pin. He was no longer a Navy SEAL. Mark took the news silently. He nodded once, then looked back at David. There was no anger in his eyes anymore. There was only shame and gratitude and the faintest glimmer of hope. He had hit the wrong man on the wrong day. But he had also found, in the most unexpected place, a chance at redemption. 6 months later, Mark completed his treatment. He walked out of the facility a different man. He was thinner, grayer, and quieter. He no longer wore the trident. He no longer talked about being a SEAL. He got a job as a construction worker, pouring concrete and building houses. It was honest work. It was humble work. And for the first time in years, he was at peace. He never forgot David. And one day, about a year after the incident, he drove to David's house. He stood on the front porch, holding a small, wooden box. When David opened the door, he did not recognize the man standing there at first. Then he saw the scar on his own cheek reflected in the other man's eyes, and he understood. "Oh, Mark," David said. "You look good." Mark held out the wooden box.